Hey everyone, welcome to my review for the Young Washington movie. Now, this is going to be my review on the historical accuracy of the movie, what it gets right, what it gets wrong, and correcting any and all of the, or at least as many of the anachronisms that I saw in the film. Now, keep in mind that this has nothing to do with the movie's use of AI, which I know there's a fair amount. It doesn't have anything to do with the acting or the actors or the actresses. This is just purely covering the history that the movie is showing and whether or not it is accurately telling the history of Washington's early life and his early military career during the French and Indian War. I've got all my notes and everything in front of me, so let's begin. Before I continue, spoiler warning. If you haven't seen it yet, get ready to get spoiled. So we're going to start with that opening scene. So we start with Washington waking up in like the back of a carriage, basically. I can already tell you that did not happen. By the time the Battle of the Monongahela had kicked off, Washington was riding around on horseback next to British General Edward Braddock. Now he did have dysentery. That is entirely accurate. That is entirely accurate. But he had like a pillow or a cushion on his saddle that helped him ride more comfortably, because dysentery it'll put you through the ringer. Then we are taken with Washington going to meet with Thomas Gage, and they're in this like field outside of the woods, which this field didn't exist. There was no field. There was no riding out of the trees to see everyone retreating. That did not happen. But then we cut to when Washington was about 10 or 11 years old. He could have been 12, maybe. I don't remember specifically. But we cut to his father's funeral, and him, I guess, reuniting. I don't know how accurate that part is. I couldn't find anything on that, but we cut to him reuniting with his older half-brother, Lawrence Washington. And for the most part, they got the impact that Lawrence had on Washington correct. Lawrence was basically a father figure for Washington. Lawrence is the reason that Washington wanted a career in the military, because Lawrence also served in the British military. And he even helped, and I'll cover this more in a bit, but he even helped Washington and their other brother, Augustine, start their own survey company called the Ohio Company. Now, in the movie, Lawrence makes a quote that sounds cool. It's even a pawn can take a king. It seems to me, at least, that it's trying to tell the audience that it's okay to question the crown and the British government, and that Lawrence is basically telling Washington to do that. Like if something is not going the way you want with the British, question it. Question their rule. But he never would have done that. He was a devout British loyalist. I don't think he ever would have told his brother, hey, resist the crown. Flash forward ahead in the movie. Just prior to the final battle scene, the Battle of the Monongahela River, in 1755, we learned that Lawrence died from consumption or tuberculosis. That is also wrong, because Lawrence died in 1752, which was 3 years prior to the Battle of the Monongahela, and also prior to any of Washington's military engagements in the French and Indian War. So they did it to give the movie some more emotional weight, but I have problems with that, because you still could have given it emotional weight and still had it affect Washington in such a way that it still influences him throughout the rest of his life. It's a small change, but I'm just nitpicking at this point with that. So next we're going to move on to Washington's relationship with Sally Fairfax. Now, Washington really did know Sally Fairfax, and they did exchange some flirtatious letters and words. But in the movie, they share a kiss under a tree one day while they're out riding. There is no evidence that there ever was any sort of kiss or physical affair, because by the time Sally had met Washington in 1748, which, by the way, is some more timeline meddling on the movie's part, Sally was already married to one of his best friends, William Fairfax, and Washington was only like 16. He wasn't in his 20s when he wasn't in his late teens, early 20s when he met Sally. So then it cuts to Washington meeting Lord Thomas Fairfax. Washington didn't meet Lord Fairfax there. He actually would have already known the Fairfaxes through his brother Lawrence, because his Lawrence married one of Lord Fairfax's daughters. I believe her name was Anne Fairfax. And Washington gets hired for this job to survey Lord Fairfax's land out west in Virginia, and that did happen, but he didn't go at it with just his one friend, and it wasn't the Ohio River country. It was actually parts of the Shenandoah Valley and Blue Ridge Mountains. Because Washington, he wouldn't enter the Ohio Territory until 1748, and he did this with his brothers Lawrence and Augustine as part of their family survey called the Ohio Company. Now, during the movie, he's introduced to a Native American chief called Tenneck also known as the Half King, and he leads Washington to a French fort, which, if the timeline is following, this is supposed to be like I want to say maybe 1752, 53, maybe. Not entirely sure on that one. But Washington wasn't the one who discovered that the French had built forts. In fact, it was a well-known fact by that point in time that the French were in the Ohio country, building a network of forts leading from Canada down to modern-day Louisiana. So it wasn't like this big secret and big reveal that the British were already there. So, on that note of this expedition in the movie, we cut to Washington's friend, Christopher Gist. He was, in fact, a real person, and he was a very skilled frontiersman, but he wasn't, in his 20s and like childhood best friends with Washington. He would have been in his 50s, and he would have been more of a mentor. He was a skilled frontiersman. Very skilled frontiersman, tracker, hunter. He would have been there to help Washington, get through everything for their survey job. Now, their trek down the Allegheny River after one of their survey jobs, not after they discovered the French, but after one of their survey jobs, that did happen because Washington did get thrown from the raft. Now, the part about the Allegheny River freezing overnight or within a few hours, I didn't find anything about that. If someone wants to correct me on that or confirm that, please, by all means, go for it. Now, as for Christopher's death at Fort Necessity, that is entirely fictional. Yes, he was at the Battle of Fort Necessity, and he was also there at the Jumonville skirmish, but he didn't die until 1759. So, again, big anachronism there, because that's like a big timeline shift. That's a 4 or 5 year difference between the Battle of Fort Necessity and his death in 1759. Again, it was probably just for emotional weight, but it was completely unnecessary, because you already get the sense that Washington is defeated. Like, he has this defeatism attitude already after. So I don't think having them kill off Christopher Gist was entirely necessary. Cutting back to when Washington leads a British envoy party to the French to discuss kicking the French out of the Ohio River country, that really did happen in 1753. He was sent on behalf of Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie. That's Dinwiddie. I know some people were confused if it was Dimwitty. That's Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie. He was sent there to speak to the French in an attempt to force them out of the Ohio country without bloodshed. The only thing I cannot 100% confirm on any of that is the dialogue, because everybody that was there is dead. But the actual encounter did really happen, and then barely a year later, Washington is going back into the Ohio country again to kick the French out, this time by force if necessary. And the way that the Jumonville Glen skirmish happened is a little contested. There's some reports that say it was like a sound that one of the Virginia militia made, or possibly it was a gunshot. I've seen both. I think it's a gunshot because that seems to be the more agreed upon. So, but it really did happen. But in the movie, it's really embellished. Now, Ensign Jumonville, the officer with the big bushy mustache, he really was killed there. But it wasn't like during the heat of the battle. Like, this would have happened after the French had already surrendered. They had tried to escape, but Tenneck-Harrison, the Half King, his Mingo Iroquois warriors would have stopped the retreat on the rear, and Washington would have approached the French ensign Jumonville, and basically what happened was they were trying to explain, like, hey, we're a political envoy, like, we're here with a message, here's the paper, read the paper. And Washington has a Dutch translator with him. He's like, I don't speak French, what they're saying even remotely true? And then Tenneck-Harrison comes up, and he reportedly said something, I can't confirm or deny this, maybe somebody else can, but he reportedly said something to Ensign Jumonville, and then he took his tomahawk and literally split his skull open. Like, that is the story that came out of there, is that he killed Ensign Jumonville. And the blame ultimately would go to Washington, like the French would blame Washington, but Washington and several other witnesses would say that this was Tenneck-Harrison or one of his warriors that did this. And Washington immediately got about to writing several letters to Governor Dinwiddie, trying to blame the French for what happened, saying that they were spies and that they were a hostile enemy force and they were not to be believed. Ultimately, Washington actually would come to regret those very letters. So, now we're going to move on to the Battle of Fort Necessity. Fort Necessity does still stand today, and it really, in the movie, it's portrayed as this big circular wooden fort of just logs, and that is exactly how it was. I'll include a picture right here. That is exactly how it looked, and that's how it looks today. Now, when the battle kicks off, the French initially are initially shooting from the tree line with their Native American allies, and that's accurate. That's how the French fought it the entire time. Now, they didn't, as far as I'm aware and from what I've read, they didn't step out and make line formations to fight against the British and the Virginia militia. And they also didn't, in the movie, they have these obnoxiously sized cannons that are more akin to a siege gun of the time, when realistically they had small swivel guns. Like, you screw the swivel gun into a log that you can stand up and then twist it around with your hand, light the fuse, boom, reload, same thing. The British would have been the only ones who had any sort of small or large artillery pieces, but it did rain. It did rain during the battle, just like it's shown in the movie, and the British powder got all wet. That's part of the reason why the French and their native allies were fighting from the trees, because their powder didn't get wet, so they were able to continuously send effective fire at Fort Necessity, which forced Washington to surrender. And for the surrender documents, that is also 100% correct, because, as I said, Washington, he had a Dutch translator with him. That translator didn't speak French fluently, and so he was either unable to, or he failed to inform Washington that the document that he was signing was a confession of murder. He was basically confessing to murdering Ensign Jumonville, which was like the whole thing. But that Jumonville skirmish is what started the French and Indian War. So when he got back, he absolutely did resign his officer commission as part of the militia, and he was basically, he had this like almost kind of defeatism attitude for a little bit, but he eventually got over it. And as stated earlier, his brother didn't die while he was gone, which is what happened in the movie. He gets back from Fort Necessity and learns his brother's dead. So realistically, the emotional weight of his brother's death doesn't have any sort of gravity on his decision to volunteer as aide-de-camp for General Braddock. Now, he really did volunteer to serve as Braddock's aide without pay, mostly because he believed that his knowledge of the frontier would help the British succeed in getting to and taking their ultimate goal, which was the French Fort Duquesne. So he believed that he could lead the British forces through and that he could work with Braddock and possibly get his military career back on track, maybe become a British officer like he wanted. Now, moving on to the Braddock expedition, there's a couple questions that we have to ask. One, are the conditions for the expedition correct, and are historical figures portrayed accurately? Now, for the conditions, yes, 100%. Dense forests, lots of mountains that they had to either traverse through, over, around. That was entirely accurate. Like having to cut down fallen trees and clear the road. They would have had engineers, sappers, whatever they had, and even just the militia and their soldiers cutting a road because they had a baggage train, they had artillery. I think Braddock brought a piano. I think he brought a piano with him. So that was absolutely true. Like, they needed all that road space for all the stuff that they were bringing. Now, in the movie, I was a little confused and I couldn't find anything on this, but it's a little confusing on how Braddock splits his force in the movie. But in reality, what happened is Braddock took about 1,300 to 1,400 of his men as a quote-unquote flying force. It was just mainly infantry, some sappers, some Native American scouts, Washington, some militia, and some artillery pieces. And their goal was just to get to Fort Duquesne and begin the siege and or take it on same day. Now, towards the end of that build-up to the start of the Battle of Monongahela, you have the British forces in a very mixed set of terrain and landscape, where some are in like this kind of, I don't really know what to call it, but it's like a little opening in the trees where it's like a almost an oval shape in the trees next to the river. You have some of the British there, you have some of the British in the forest, some in a valley or a plain on that other side of the forest where the rest are still coming in from. That is entirely false. There was no U-shaped area of trees. There was no plain or valley or whatever it was. They would have been stuck in the middle of a very densely packed forest. It would have made marching very difficult, and it would have made even just standard formations for shooting very difficult, and even artillery would have been completely useless. The British still, they struggled to move through it. Like they would have struggled to move through that, and they wouldn't have been as stretched out as they would have been. They would have been several, probably, I want to say maybe like 5 men wide formations, ranging probably companies, battalions, regiments, however you want to call it, and then maybe like skirmishers on their right and left flanks. And then I'll get into this more, but then there would also been like hills on their flanks that they just were marching in between. But we start off the battle, and like I said, terrain all wrong. The battle took place entirely in a wooded area, no open fields. There was no defensive stand at the river where you see the militia running out of ammunition. And like I said, there's no representation for the heights that would have been on the British flanks, where the French and their native allies, yes, the French were firing from in front. They had line formations of their own, but the French-Canadian militia and their native allies, they would have been taking the heights on the flanks of the British, and it's just enfilade fire, just fire coming down from all different directions. And the British are just stuck in between these two hills, and they're taking, and you got guys getting shot in the back, in the front, from the left, from the right. Like, there's no, and the British are trying to make their formations work for this, but they're just getting picked off one by one because, for British formations, it's present, take aim, fire, like they have to wait for the command. I know that command sequence was all wrong, but they have to wait for commands to reload, to fire, certain formations, fix bayonets. Like the French Canadians and their native allies and the Native Americans with them, they would have been just shooting non-stop. So you've got the British over here waiting for all these different commands, and they're just getting picked off one by one, especially the officers. The officer corps amongst that British column was decimated. Another inaccuracy is that the French seem to have artillery at this battle. That is nowhere close to accurate. Again, I saw these oversized guns that should have been that would have been siege guns. They didn't have any cannons at all, but you see explosions going off amongst the British lines in the movie. That is entirely false. They had no artillery. The only artillery the French would have had would have been at Fort Duquesne, and the British weren't even close to there yet. And then, like I said at the very beginning of the review, Washington, he did have dysentery, but he wasn't passed out in a wagon. He wasn't in any sort of medical coma or anything like what we see. He would have been, I mean, he's General Braddock's aide-de-camp. He would have been right next to Braddock, or at the very least near him the entire time, running around, relaying orders, passing off orders, bringing reports to Braddock. And Washington's also depicted as kind of like the John Rambo of the battle, because you see him picking up flintlocks, muskets, and pistols, and running around. He's shooting with deadly accuracy. I mean, granted, point blank range at certain points that's as accurate as you're gonna get, but like he's seen with the musket and the pistol. He would have, at the very least, I could see the flintlock pistol, but not the musket. He would have probably had like a sword. At the very least, a sword would have been at his side, and he would have had a pistol. You know, he's holding out. He's taking shots every now and then, trying to survive. And what isn't really shown all that well is that he did have 2 horses shot out from under him. And then there's one scene in the movie where he's rescuing the militia from this area of the battle that didn't happen, but he just kind of stands there while like 4 Native Americans just shoot at him, and these are French-aligned Native Americans, and they shoot at him. He just kind of stands there, and he's completely unscathed, and then he shoots with the musket and the pistol. But he would have been running around on horseback most of the time. And yes, he was shot at, because after the battle he found several holes from musket balls in his coat and his hat, and he came out of the battle without so much as a scratch on him. But he didn't just stand there and take it. Like that's not, just that infuriated me. I watched that and I couldn't believe that was what they chose to go with. Another point is that we see these 2 enslaved men in the battle, and yes, there were slaves present at the battle, but it was far more than 2. It's a very toned down version of what actually happened, because in reality, you have to think of the time period. There would have been a number of slaves present at the battle, but not in any sort of combative position or presence. Like they would have been laborers, servants, and cooks for the troops and officers. My next point, which was another point that infuriated me, is in the movie it's kind of shown and also presumed that General Braddock is killed during the battle. When you see him give his sash to Washington and say, "Lead the troops," Braddock was shot, but he was mortally wounded, and Washington didn't just ride up and find him. He was right there when it happened. Braddock was shot off his horse, and yes, he did order Washington to organize the troops and retreat from battle, and Washington did that. He organized a very successful rearguard action that gave the rest of the British forces, or at least the ones that managed to escape, time to get back across the Monongahela River. And Braddock, he died a few days after the battle. I've heard anywhere from 3 to 5 days. I can't confirm. But he was actually buried not far from the site of Fort Necessity, and he was his grave was actually in the middle of the road that they had carved out through the forest. He was buried there so that his men could march over his burial spot to hide the presence of his grave, because they didn't want Native Americans to come by and see, oh hey, there's a grave. Let's see who just got buried. And then at the end of the battle, they tried to turn it into like this inspirational, like, oh, we survived, so we're gonna call this a victory. No, 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 no. In so many ways, no. The end of this battle was a chaotic mess. You have almost a third of the British forces killed, another third wounded, and a large number, including camp followers, women, slaves, civilian engineers, and sappers. Anybody that wasn't part of the regular British or colonial force that were kidnapped by the French-aligned Native Americans, either to indoctrinate them into the tribes or to be ransomed to the French. And another thing that they don't show is what the French-aligned Native Americans did to any wounded or straggling British or colonial troops that were left at the battle site, which is they tomahawked and butchered, scalped, and looted the dead and wounded. Like, it was a brutal sight. Like, you can still go to this area sometimes, and if you look hard enough, you will find the remains of dead British soldiers. Like, it is a well-known fact. It's just like the massacre of Fort William Henry. You can go to the area where it happened, and if you look hard enough, you will find the skeletons of some of the people that were killed there. But that's enough on the battle. We're gonna move to a scene that happened almost immediately after, where Washington is approached by his former Native American ally, Tenneck, also known as the Half King, asking him to follow him up this random mountain. First, that couldn't have happened because the mountain most likely didn't exist, and if it did, the whole scene is fake. It's false. Because second, Tenneck died almost a year prior to the Battle of the Monongahela. Like, he was dead. Like, I'm sorry to burst all your bubbles, but that's another big anachronism. You have a already dead character making an appearance long after his confirmed death, and then leading him into a conversation that Washington isn't going to have for 15 years. 15 years, people. Yes, he had a conversation with a Native American chief who told him that he had ordered his warriors to shoot at Washington. That really did happen. The chief really did do that. And the chief was very rightly surprised that Washington survived all the hits. As I said earlier, Washington would look over his uniform when he got back and see, like, oh man, I've got holes from musket balls in here. How am I not bleeding? How am I not dead? But this conversation wouldn't happen until 1770. Why are you gonna muddle the timeline that bad for a supposedly inspirational scene where it's supposed to lead into this this divine legend or divine prophecy or whatever you want to call it? I can't confirm how accurate that part is, that prophecy or whatever. If anybody can find any more information on it, please, I would love to learn some more. But near as I can tell, the legend, prophecy, whatever you want to call it, it does exist. And there are some Native warriors at the time that believed it did apply to Washington, because it's like, how do you shoot at a guy? How do your warriors, who are supposedly the most trained marksmen of the frontier and part of Native American tribes, how do they shoot at a guy and completely miss when they're supposedly the best shots in that region? But yeah, that whole conversation, also, I was fuming with that. But we get to the end of the movie, and it's a little bit deceptive. More like a lot. First, we're kind of led to believe that Washington is supposed to be forming a colonial militia to help the British combat Native hostility on the frontier in Virginia, Pennsylvania, all along that region that borders the Ohio River country. That couldn't have happened because the official regiment had already been formed a year prior in 1754. So more likely what happened is that he was given his commission back, because I actually can't even find any evidence that he did really resign it. As near as I can tell, he did, but I can't officially confirm that. I'm only going off of what I saw, and what I saw says that he did resign it. But he would have probably just been said, they probably would have just, the local governors would have said, hey, you just came back from this battle, you did save a good chunk of the force, here's command of the Virginia Regiment, go fight the natives. And then that next scene after some on-screen, if I remember correctly, there's some like on-screen quotes or lines or whatever you want to call it. I don't remember what it's called. I don't remember what the term is. But it flashes forward to where we see that Washington is like forming up the Virginia Regiment. He's like about to speak to them. We can see that two of his friends that were present throughout most of the movie, especially during all three battles, are standing in that formation. But the date on the screen is 1776. Am I wrong on that? Because if that's right, then the actor that is playing Washington should have been aged, or they should have gotten someone who looked older, and his friends should have also looked older. But also, if this is in 1776, the uniform is wrong that he's wearing. It's not a blue and white coat, because that's what he's wearing, a blue and white coat. It would have been a blue coat with like a yellowish kind of gold lining, like on the outside where like all the buttons and stuff are. And in certain interpretations of his uniform, he also has gold epaulets. I didn't see any gold epaulets, did you? So just that that scene is so confusing, because are we in 1755 or in 1776? Because if we're in 1776, should have aged the actor or gotten a different actor to play older Washington. His friends either should have been aged or shouldn't have been there. Like, I just overall, if historical accuracy isn't your thing, if that's not why you watch a movie, or you just had no clue that Washington even fought in the French and Indian War, and you are loving the fact that you're learning this fact, then this movie is perfect for you. It does give off a patriotic feeling, as it should, because it's a movie about the first president of the United States. But I don't get that feeling. When I watch a historical movie, even if it's just pure fiction, I'm looking for the facts in the fiction. Take, for instance, the movie Last of the Mohicans. The story itself, the love story, is fictional, and so are most of the characters involved. But the real-life events of the siege of Fort William Henry and the subsequent massacre of Fort William Henry really did happen. And they went with for the massacre, they went with the more exaggerated version where casualty numbers were heavily inflated to, kind of like hammer the nail in that the Native Americans, they're brutal, they'll massacre you and everyone that you know and love. Like that's how it was propaganda, basically. And I know that some people have done this to me. They've brought up movies like 300 or Saving Private Ryan, and I can answer to both of those as well. 300 is based on a graphic novel, and it plays more into the stories and legends and myths that were spread after the Battle of Thermopylae that exaggerated what really happened, because the legend says that the Persian army was 1,000,000 men strong, and that it was just the brave 300 and a few other warriors from other city-states. No, it was the 300 Spartans and then like 1,100 other warriors that were at the Hot Gates at Thermopylae. And also the Spartans would have been decked out from head to toe in full armor. You're not looking at a bunch of dudes wearing underwear with one helmet, the shield, spear, maybe a sword hidden somewhere in there, and a cape. Like, they would have been decked out in full armor. So again, that's based on the graphic novel, so you can't really compare that. And as for Saving Private Ryan, yes, characters are completely fictional, but the movie is based on real life events and is also probably the most accurate depiction of the D-Day landings that you will ever see, and even D-Day Plus. They accurately represent that airborne units were thrown all over the place and that even some were mixed up. Yes, the town in which the final battle happens is, as far as I can tell, fake. It shows the real life accurate or almost accurate, or at least as accurate as you can get combat that would have been taking place. And as you know, saving for Private Ryan, yes, he's fake, but the events that inspired the movie did actually happen. So it is based in some historical fact, and they use real historical events and they accurately portray those events. But for Young Washington, you're making a movie about the early life of America's first president. Why wouldn't you want 100% accurate storytelling? Wouldn't you want to? I would love to see the most faithful retelling of his early life so that we can see the man beyond what we already learn in school. Like, I don't want an over-dramatized, over-fictionalized version of the character that runs around like he's Rambo, picking up every musket and pistol that he sees and leading fake charges and defensive line formations that didn't happen. Like, I'm sorry, I can't get over that. To finish this review, I have to say I can't bring myself to recommend this movie to anyone. Not when there are so many blatant inaccuracies and anachronisms in this movie. I will say it's slightly better than Napoleon, which is a disastrous movie review for another day. But for now, thank you all for joining me for my historical review of Young Washington, and I'll see y'all next time.